Right now, there's probably salt sitting somewhere within arm's reach of you, on your kitchen counter, in a shaker on the table, dissolved into whatever you had for lunch. You use it every day without thinking about it. And that's exactly the problem, because the story of how salt got there is one of the strangest and most consequential stories in all of human history. It didn't start with grocery stores or trade routes or Roman soldiers getting paid in it. It started much, much earlier, before cities, before farming, before anything we'd recognize as civilization. The question is how early, and when you actually start digging into the evidence, the answer turns out to be genuinely surprising. Let's start with why salt even matters biologically, because that explains everything that came after. Your body cannot function without sodium. It regulates fluid balance, transmits nerve signals, allows your muscles to contract, and keeps your heart beating at the right rhythm. Without enough of it, your cells stop communicating properly. You become confused, fatigued, and eventually your organs begin to shut down. This isn't a modern nutritional concern. It was a biological reality for every human and every human ancestor that ever lived. The need is hardwired. The question was never whether ancient people needed salt. It was whether they had to go looking for it. For most of early human history, they probably didn't. Here's why. When your diet is primarily animal-based, as it was for most hunter-gatherers for most of their existence, you're already getting significant amounts of sodium from meat, blood, and organs. Wild game is naturally salty. A prehistoric person eating a freshly killed animal was consuming sodium with every bite, without ever having to think about it. This is probably one of the reasons salt didn't become a major topic of concern until much later in the archaeological record. When you're eating animals, salt takes care of itself. The problem started when the diet changed. Around 10,000 years ago, agriculture began to spread across the world. People started eating more grains, legumes, and cultivated plants. That sounds like an upgrade, and in some ways it was, but plant foods are dramatically lower in sodium than animal foods. A diet built around wheat, barley, lentils, and millet gave early farmers calories and carbohydrates, but it quietly stripped away the sodium they'd been getting effortlessly before. Researchers who have studied the diets of early agricultural communities estimate that the shift to farming could have reduced sodium intake by as much as 75% compared to a hunter-gatherer diet. That's not a small adjustment. That's a fundamental change in what your body is getting every day. So now you have populations of people whose bodies still need sodium just as badly as their ancestors did, but whose food is no longer providing it. That's the gap. And when a biological need isn't being met, humans have a reliable tendency to figure out how to fill it. The earliest evidence of deliberate salt use clusters around this same window in history, not coincidentally, in areas where agriculture was spreading fastest. The timing isn't an accident. Salt became a problem at roughly the same moment that farming began, and people started solving that problem almost immediately. The oldest direct evidence of salt production found so far comes from a site in Romania called Lunca, in the region of Moldavia. Archaeologists working there found the remains of a small structure that had been used based on the chemical analysis of soil and residue, specifically for boiling brine. The site dates to around 6000 BCE, making it roughly 8,000 years old. What they found wasn't just traces of salt, they found fragments of ceramic vessels that had been repeatedly heated over fire, the same kind of scorched thick-walled pots that show up later at confirmed salt production sites across Europe. The people at Lunca weren't stumbling across salt accidentally. They had built a facility to make it. Now, let's talk about what that actually tells us. Building a dedicated structure to produce a single mineral means that salt was already understood as something worth the effort. You don't construct a specialized facility for something you just happened to find one afternoon. By the time the Lunca site was in operation, people already knew that briny spring water could be boiled down, that the white crystals left behind were the thing they were after, and that those crystals were valuable enough to justify sustained, organized labor. That level of understanding doesn't appear from nowhere. It builds up over generations of observation and experimentation, which means the knowledge almost certainly predates the physical evidence we've found. The challenge with tracing salt further back is that it doesn't preserve the way other foods do. Organic material leaves residue. Charred seeds, animal bones, plant fibers, and pottery stains all survive for thousands of years under the right conditions. Salt dissolves. It leaves almost nothing behind unless it was being processed in large quantities in a fixed location, or unless it was used in a context where it interacted with something durable. This is why the archaeological record of early salt use has so many gaps. We're not finding it because salt by its nature disappears. Some of the more indirect evidence points even further back. Rock salt outcrops and brine springs exist across Africa, Europe, and Asia, and many of the oldest known animal trails in the world lead directly to them. Animals have been finding salt licks for millions of years. Early humans watched animals. They followed their movements to find water, to predict migration routes, to locate prey. It would have been essentially impossible for early Homo sapiens, or even earlier hominins, to follow large herds of mammals and not eventually notice that certain locations drew animals back repeatedly and that the ground or water there tasted different. The sensory experience of salt is not subtle. Your body responds to it immediately. There's also evidence from a different direction, which is the genetics of salt taste perception. Humans have a strong and specific preference for salty flavor, mediated by dedicated taste receptors that respond almost exclusively to sodium ions. That preference is not learned. Infants show a preference for slightly salty water over plain water as early as 4 months of age, before any significant dietary conditioning has had a chance to occur. The biology strongly suggests that sodium-seeking behavior has been selected for over a very long period of time, probably far longer than agriculture has existed. The brain was already primed to want salt long before anyone started building evaporation pans to get it. Let's talk about what happened once people started producing salt deliberately, because the effects moved far beyond nutrition. Salt is one of the most effective food preservatives ever discovered. Packing meat or fish in salt draws moisture out through osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria can't survive. This sounds like a simple trick, but the implications are enormous. Before salt preservation, food had to be eaten quickly or dried slowly in conditions that weren't always available. With salt, you could take a catch of fish and extend its useful life by weeks or months. You could slaughter an animal in autumn and still be eating it in winter. Salt didn't just season food, it changed how long food could exist. This is probably why salt shows up so prominently in the archaeological record at coastal sites. People living near the ocean had access to seawater, which could be evaporated into salt. They also had access to large quantities of fish, which could be preserved with it. The combination was powerful. Sites along the shores of China, the Mediterranean, and the Atlantic coast of Europe all show signs of salt-related activity going back thousands of years, and in several cases, the preserved fish found at these sites turned up at inland locations far removed from any coastline. That means salt wasn't just being used locally, it was being used to create portable, tradable food supplies that could move across significant distances. The Chinese evidence deserves particular attention here. At a site in Shanxi province called Yuncheng, there is a large salt lake called Lake Xieiqi that has been producing salt for a very long time. The lake is surrounded by archaeological evidence of human habitation stretching back roughly 6,000 years, and Chinese historical records reference the salt produced there in some of the oldest texts in the language. By around 2000 BCE, there is clear evidence of organized salt harvesting from the lake, but researchers believe the site had been exploited much earlier than the written record captures. The geography is striking. Several of China's oldest settlements cluster around this lake in ways that suggest proximity to salt was a meaningful factor in where people chose to live. You see the same pattern in other parts of the world. In Central Europe, a site called Hallstatt in what is now Austria became one of the most important salt mining locations of the ancient world. The word Hallstatt and the related word Hallein both derive from an old Celtic root that simply means salt. The mines at Hallstatt date back to at least 1200 BCE, and the community that grew up around them became remarkably wealthy by the standards of the time. Salt miners were buried with bronze jewelry and elaborate grave goods. The mine preserved organic materials so well that archaeologists have found wooden tools, leather bags, and even human remains that are thousands of years old, still identifiable because the salt in the mine had kept them from decomposing. It's almost poetic that the same substance being mined there was also doing the preserving. Now, let's talk about the economics of this, because once salt production became organized, salt became money. Not metaphorically. In many ancient societies, salt was used as a direct medium of exchange. Roman soldiers were reportedly paid a salarium, a salt allowance, which is where the English word salary comes from. Whether the soldiers were actually handed physical salt or simply given pay intended for salt is debated. But the linguistic trace is real, and it tells you something important about how central salt was to the Roman economic imagination. It was the kind of thing valuable enough to stand in for currency. The same dynamic showed up across sub-Saharan Africa, where salt from the Saharan salt flats was traded southward for gold, ivory, and other goods. In some parts of West Africa, the exchange rate between salt and gold by weight was essentially 1-to-1. Salt came from the north, gold came from the south, and the trade routes that connected them became some of the wealthiest corridors in the medieval world. Timbuktu didn't become one of the richest cities on earth because of its location alone. It became rich in large part because it sat at the crossroads of those two flows. Salt going south, gold going north, and everyone in the middle taking a cut. What's worth sitting with is how completely invisible all of this seems from the modern perspective. Salt is so cheap now that it's essentially free. You can buy a kilogram of it for less than the cost of a single cup of coffee. That price reflects modern industrial extraction, global shipping, and a supply that is, for all practical purposes, limitless. The ocean alone contains enough dissolved sodium chloride to cover every continent on Earth in a layer roughly 150 meters deep. We are not running out of salt. But for most of human history, the situation was completely different. Getting enough salt required either living near a natural source, organizing labor to extract it, or trading for it across long distances. None of those things were free. All of them shaped where civilizations formed and how they operated. There's also a darker side to this history, which is that control over salt meant control over people. The gabelle, the French salt tax, was one of the most despised institutions in pre-revolutionary France. It required every person above the age of 8 to purchase a minimum amount of salt each year at a price set by the crown. Prices varied wildly between provinces, which created smuggling networks and widespread resentment that fed directly into the frustrations that eventually exploded in 1789. Salt taxes appeared in one form or another in ancient China, medieval England, Mughal India, and across colonial Africa. Wherever governments needed revenue and populations needed salt, taxation followed almost automatically, because there was no avoiding it. You could refuse to buy luxury good. You couldn't refuse sodium. Mahatma Gandhi understood this perfectly. When he chose salt as a symbolic center of his campaign of civil disobedience against British colonial rule in 1930, it wasn't arbitrary. The British salt monopoly in India forced Indians to buy salt they could have harvested themselves from the sea, at prices inflated by colonial taxation. The Salt March, in which Gandhi led followers roughly 240 miles to the coast to make salt directly from seawater, was one of the most carefully chosen acts of political symbolism in modern history. Salt connected directly to survival, to ancient practice, to the most basic human need. Taking a stand over salt meant taking a stand over something no one could pretend wasn't essential, and this goes back further than any of the written history. It goes back to those early agricultural communities in Romania and China who first noticed that the food they were now eating wasn't giving their bodies what they needed, and started building ways to fix that. It goes back to whoever first watched animals return again and again to a mineral outcrop and tasted the ground or the water and understood what the animals were after. It goes back to a biology that was already seeking sodium millions of years before anyone knew what sodium was. The drive was always there. The methods just kept getting more elaborate. Let's talk about how ancient peoples actually found salt before organized production existed, because this part of the story is often skipped. Natural salt sources come in several forms. There are halite deposits, which are solid rock salt formations created by the evaporation of ancient seas. There are brine springs, where groundwater picks up dissolved salt as it moves through subsurface mineral layers and emerges at the surface already salty. There are salt lakes and seasonal salt pans that form in arid regions. And there is, of course, the ocean. Each of these sources would have been encountered differently, used differently, and understood differently by the people who lived near them. A community next to a brine spring had a very different relationship with salt than a group that had to walk 3 days to reach the nearest salt flat. The distance problem shaped human behavior in ways that are still echoing. Communities with easy access to salt could use it freely and build food preservation into their daily routines. Communities far from salt sources had to either trade, travel, or adapt their diets. In some parts of the world, ash from certain plants was used as a salt substitute, since the ash contains mineral salts that provide some of the same dietary function. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa and highland Papua New Guinea, plant ash was traded and used as a seasoning and mineral supplement for centuries. It wasn't as effective as sodium chloride, but when sodium chloride wasn't available, it was what people had. By the time large urban civilizations appeared, salt had been woven into human life for so long that it had taken on meanings far beyond the dietary. It appeared in religious ritual across Mesopotamia, where salt was placed on offerings to signal purity and permanence. The Hebrew Bible references salt as part of covenant offerings and uses it as a metaphor for faithfulness and incorruptibility. The ancient Greeks rubbed salt into sacred objects. In many African traditions, salt is still used in ceremonies marking birth, death, and transition. The biological need came first, and then, over thousands of years, salt accumulated symbolism the way it accumulates in deposits. Layer after layer, from something the body demanded into something the culture depended on. The oldest preserved salt workings that archaeologists have confirmed so far are those brine boiling operations from around 6000 BCE. But the knowledge behind them, the understanding that salt could be extracted, processed, and used, almost certainly extends back further than the physical evidence shows. Some researchers working on dietary patterns in pre-agricultural populations have suggested that intentional salt seeking may date back at least 10,000 years, and possibly considerably further. The tools leave no trace. The knowledge leaves no trace. What remains is the outline of a behavior so old and so consistent across human cultures worldwide that it had to have begun long before anyone was keeping records of it.